Okay, welcome to this next readings lecture where I try and tell you something interesting about the stuff that you already read. What we're doing here in this podcast, and I hope you guys like the podcast, give me feedback in here or on the reading / listening perusal for the actual material itself about whether you enjoyed that or not. Leave comments here if you actually downloaded the podcast or listened to it not on perusal but on your phone, and whether that was good too. What we're doing here is one of our very first kind of psychology readings that really emphasizes the psychology, because this podcast, it's an amateur person who's just kind of well researched. He's a writer and does a lot of psychology in his writing, but not a professional psychologist. But what we're talking about here today is the psychology of tribalism, because that affects very deeply our ability to think critically about a whole range of issues. And one of the things which I'm not sure that he spends a lot of time on, probably because he assumes everybody's going to be familiar with it, is this concept of motivated reasoning. And it's a weird couple of words because it probably doesn't mean what you think it means the first time you hear it. The idea behind motivated reasoning isn't that it's like eager reasoning or reasoning that has been incentivized or something like that directly, as in we want you to like think more about this or something. It's reasoning that's directed towards some desired goal. That is, you already have the goal in mind and you are thinking about how to get there, which doesn't sound like a bad thing, but in the context which we're going to be using it, it is. Maybe a better way to characterize what psychologists call motivated reasoning is rationalizing. So instead of justifying something, we use the word rationalizing to say, well, you got into this mess or situation over here, and you're trying to generate some kind of rationale for why things ended up the way they did or why you chose what you did. And so you take as one of the kind of the background pieces of information that that particular decision has already been made, and you're trying to, after the fact, construct what looks like a persuasive and sensible set of reasons about why things happened the way they did or why that decision happened the way that it did. And in a very important sense, that's working backwards, right? You're reasoning from a desired conclusion to find some reasons that support that conclusion, rather than starting with asking basically an open-ended question where you haven't already decided what the correct answer is going to be, and doing your research to find all sorts of reasons and then from those deciding what the correct answer is. No, motivated reasoning starts with the answer that you want to be right and works backwards from there. And human beings do this a lot. You do this a lot, right? Sometimes we do it with full awareness that we're doing it. And sometimes we do it and we're not really, or we're working hard to make ourselves not so aware that we are really just trying to justify something that we've already decided to do, and we're trying to basically CYA or protect ourselves from other people asking us why we chose something when maybe objectively speaking that was the bad decision or something like that. And this kind of backwards reasoning, this kinds of rationalization procedures, because you already have the desired answer in mind, and all you're doing is looking around for stuff that will help make that answer sound reasonable, you're much more likely to engage in a whole bunch of really sketchy kinds of reasoning, like cherry picking. That's where you pick examples or situations that are illustrative or supportive of your position, and you pick them because they're supportive and not because they're kind of representative. You didn't pick that example at random. You picked it on purpose because it backs up your point. That's cherry picking. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is just the general psychological trait that we all have, which is we pay attention to and find more important examples or reasons that tend to reinforce or support our view, and diminish reasons, evidence, situations, examples that disconfirm or give trouble to our viewpoint. And all sorts of other thinking errors are much more likely when you already have a vested interest or you already have decided what the quote-unquote correct answer is going to be, and you're working backwards to find reasons why that is the sensible correct answer to reach. So that is the key. That's one of the central things about tribalism, is that you already have a tribe and you're already invested in the tribe that you belong to's viewpoints, conclusions being the correct ones. And so motivated reasoning happens a lot when you're thinking tribally. And in the context of the reading of the podcast, of course, he's specifically talking about political tribalism. And I'm going to be focusing on that in the slideshow here too. But you can see it happen anywhere that we happen to be kind of cut up into groups as human beings. We tribe up really easily. You can think about any time there's teams, any times there's regions, anytime there are groups, this can and usually does happen. But for politics especially, the reason why the podcast got made and the reason why I'm talking about it here is because it's presently kind of interesting and salient, both because the degree of tribalism in politics has increased in the recent past, and by recent past I'm talking like an old person, and I mean decades and not years or months, okay? And the kinds of impacts that those political tribes have on our everyday lives has also gotten greater because national politics is now influencing and participating in our beliefs and relationships that aren't about national politics much more than it used to. And so we can see this is a chart that I picked up. I did a little research to try and find some of the things that the podcast was talking about. So I found charts like this, where you can see over 30 years. These are charts of where they questioned card-carrying Democrats and Republicans, that is, people who are official members of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Usually people are quote-unquote card-carrying party members because many states you have to be one to vote in the primaries for that party and select the candidate that's going to stand for the general election for that party. And so you can see back in 1994, which is in historical terms not that long ago, that the average Democrat and the average Republican on a 10-point, they quizzed people on a 10-point scale of political values and asked them, you can think of kind of regular hot button political questions. Are you in favor of or oppose X? Are you in favor of or oppose Y? That kind of thing. They asked them 10 questions to try and figure out for each individual person, where are you on this scale? And then they asked them their party membership if they had one. And you can see that Democrats are this lump here and Republicans are this lump here. And they're not, there's a lot of overlap here. And in 2004, 10 years later, still lots of overlap. You can see a little bit of shift there, but that could just be statistical noise, right? That might not be anything significant. But by 2014, wow. So you can see that the median, the difference between the average Democrat and Republican kind of stayed the same in that 10 years, but bam, opened up a lot there, and the overlap is a lot less. So, and one would imagine that when they conduct this same survey in 2024, that the gap is going to keep widening. We could speculate. It sounds like reasonable speculation here. These are regular voters that they ask this question of. But we can also ask this same sort of question of the representatives that regular voters elect to Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And we do that not with the same 10-point questionnaire. This time what they did is they kind of measured the people's viewpoints, their positions from liberal to conservative based on voting records. So they would score, I'm not exactly sure the details on this, they would score particular pieces of legislation as being liberal or conservative and how liberal or conservative, and then they would track particular representatives' voting records on those things to kind of score them and place them on this spectrum here from -1 to +1 on the liberal conservative scale. And these charts go back a lot further, another 30 years, right? So this chart right here, this chart right here tracks, is kind of lined up. Think about 1994, ancient past, where the average voters were pretty close to one another within the parties. And in 93, 94, you can see that Congress, much more divided, much less overlap. The average Democrat is on this side. The average Republican is right in this bar here somewhere. And there's some pretty healthy separation there, but also not very much overlap. That overlap, much better in the 70s, right? So the 1970s in Congress looked a lot much more like 1994 among voters, right? But then by the time you get to 94 in Congress, we look a lot more like 2014. So it looks like Congress is kind of leading the way, which is kind of weird because voters put politicians in office, and so it's weird that it might seem weird to you that politicians actually are more polarized than the voters that they represent. But if you know things about primary processes and things like that, this might not be super surprising. There are various incentives for politicians to cater to reflect the values of the more extreme members of their party, the ones furthest to the edges of the spectrum. And so it's not super surprising that politicians kind of lead the way in terms of partisanship here. And then by the 2010s, there's no overlap. And they have moved even further apart. What I wanted to, so first thing I want to say is this shows that Congress kind of leads the way. So if you're listening to politicians talk about values and their viewpoints and things like that, that even listening to all of them, both sides, right, you're not going to get an accurate representation of what the average American voter thinks. Even though the average American voter has become more polarized, these folks are even more polarized than the average American voter. All right. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that we have kind of two different activities happening, two different mechanisms that explain or account for this kind of splitting and separation of the two parties in America. And I'll give you another side note, which is that this happens, generally speaking, in two-party systems. If you're familiar with parliamentary democracies, where there are multiple parties, take a political science course if you want to learn more about that, then you tend to have less of this, because when a gap opens up like this, a third party can pop up and cater to voters who happen to, say, be in the middle, or if one of these parties gets dragged towards the center by whatever, then another party can credibly pop up over here to cater to voters who are more of the kind of extreme persuasion on one end or the other, right? We have kind of a couple things going on that explain why this has happened. The first one is that it used to be the case that the Democrats and the Republicans in the 70s and before were much more of regional parties rather than ideologically defined parties. That is, Democrats were not traditionally identified as being the liberals, even though the chart kind of reveals that here by the 70s, and Republicans were not traditionally the conservatives. It was more that Democrats were the party of the South, and the Republicans were the party of the North, and that kind of traces back to, Civil War, Reconstruction era kind of things too. But by the 70s, that was starting to change, and that's why you see this kind of split here. They had all sorts of terms for Southern Democrats who were not very liberal, that is the blue people over here, right? Dixiecrats or Blue Dog Democrats, or even just the politest of terms, Southern Democrats, right? And I think they had the same kind of terms for Republicans that were politer than rhinos. But the other thing, so that's one of the things that explains this divergence in the two parties' ideologies and their kind of refinements at becoming a party that really represented a specific set of political commitments, ideological commitments. Now we do have two parties that are very ideologically distinct from one another in certain key respects, and also the geography that separates the two, instead of being north-south, has moved more towards kind of a population density kind of thing. So you have inner cities, urban areas being dominated by Democrats and more rural areas dominated by Republicans. That is not a strange thing, because both before this, in the south-north geographic split, and in the more modern urban-rural split, the reason why those things happen is because those were relevant locations of ideological differences, right? 200 years ago, there were distinct and important ideological differences between the South and the North, and presently, not so much. Now the ideological differences and the priorities of voters differ more they depend more on whether the voter is in an urban area or in a rural area. Okay? But that's political science. So it's this sorting and polarization process. There's two ways to kind of assemble your tribe and define your tribe that are happening in these kind of charts here. The first one is sorting. So basically, you join a tribe, maybe you don't know very much about what the tribe is like because it's just the tribe that's in your area. Think about a sports team. Usually you follow a sports team that is geographically the closest one to you. And when you're a kid, or it's the one that one of your parents follow, and you really don't have very much appreciation for the finer points of that particular sport, you haven't formed any preferences about what style of play you like in that sport, and so you just grow up to be a fan of that team, and it doesn't really matter what that team's like, even whether they win a lot or lose a lot or anything like that. You grow up, you start getting a little discernment, a little bit of knowledge about the sport that you still follow, and maybe your feelings are going to change such that now you prefer to have a team that wins. Or you prefer to have a team that plays in a certain style, or you prefer a team that has a certain particular player on it. And so you sort yourself, you switch parties, you switch fandoms to belong better. Once you learn a little bit about yourself, you might join a group that reflects your particular identity, values, priorities better than the one you kind of maybe accidentally happened to find yourself in. And that's called sorting. That doesn't change your particular views as an individual, and it doesn't change the overall society's points of view at all either. It just puts you in the right bucket. It's like the Harry Potter sorting hat kind of thing. That's what we're talking about here. And so you can see that from the 1973 Congress to the 1993 Congress, there's a little bit of peak movement and stuff like that, but really it's the people here, those two small blue guys here, and some of the blue over here and some of the red over here, they probably just switched parties to better reflect to switch from that geographical allegiance that their party kind of exemplified to the ideological allegiance that their principles, viewpoints, values reflected better. The second kind of tribing up is substantially different, and that's what we're going to call polarization. And that's where people actually change their views on an individual and societal level collectively. That is, everybody moves further away from the middle on average. So that's kind of maybe the dominant change that happened from 93-94 to 2011-2012. People left the middle area. This isn't a fact of people switching. People just switching parties can't account for the fact, because there's actually objectively less people here than there are here. Those people something must have happened to those people. And usually what happens is either, for Congress particularly, the people in the middle here got primary, that is, they lost their jobs and got replaced by another politician in that same district who lived further over here or further over here, right? Or that same politician kept their job by shifting their views and their voting record from here over to one of the extremes. And there might still be people here who never changed their views from 93 to 2011, right? Or everybody here might have kind of inched left and everybody here might have inched right a little bit. You can't tell from these graphs in particular, but on average what's happened is that the members of each party have had, on average, their views become more extreme along the kind of the scale that they already were being measured on. So everybody moves a little to drag both lumps away from each other, or some people move a lot and move right out of the middle and over to the other end, and that's what moves the two peaks. Why? And what other ways does this show up? Well, here's some more kind of data. I hope this is big enough for you to kind of zoom in and take a look at. One of these things, and so this is the result of 2019 surveys, is that you've got this pie chart here where basically 3/4 of Republican and Democratic voters say that not only do our parties and our voters disagree about what plans and policies are correct for our nation, but we also can't even agree on the basic facts that those policies, viewpoints, plans are built off of. Right? Which is kind of scary that we can't that people can't generally agree on what the basic facts are. That's kind of weird. Used to be the politics was sufficiently busy and sufficiently interesting when everybody agreed on the basic facts but maybe disagreed on their interpretation or disagreed on what the most promising or best or most appropriate solution to the problems were. Now this kind of result suggests that the two different parties can't even agree not only on what the most pressing problems are, but what the basic facts are that give rise to those problems. Right? Also, partisans, that is committed Republicans and or Democrats, see the other side as being closed-minded, and in addition, this might be a little bit of a shot at Republicans, Republicans see Democrats as unpatriotic. So this is talking about the perception of people in the other party. So you can see that 60% of Republicans say Democrats are more closed-minded than other Americans. So 2/3 of Republicans say that of Democrats. 3/4 of Democrats say that of Republicans, right? And there's little partisan agreement on major problems facing the U.S., right? So you can see the split between the average viewpoint of the Republican or leaning towards Republican voter versus the Democrat or leaning Democrat reporter. There's some stuff that seems to have fairly consistent consensus viewpoints, right? Both members of both parties or people who are sympathetic to each party. Doesn't seem to make a bit of difference when you're talking about terrorism and whether it's a major problem or the deficit or drug addiction. Now, that doesn't mean that members of both parties agree on maybe what potential solutions there might be. That would be what you might call kind of traditional politics. They agree on the problem. They might not agree on what the best solution that or what the role of government should be in dealing with these kinds of things. But as you can see in these other ones, these other topics, right, there's big disagreement about whether these even count as problems. And so you can see the ones up top here are ones where the Republicans tend to say it's not a big problem, but the Democrats say, oh wait, it is. And over down here on the bottom, there's just one on this particular survey here where it's the Democrats who are dismissive that it is a big problem, but the Republicans are not. But these are all just facts here. These are all just survey results talking what looks like a fairly big schism that explains the distance between those two peaks. Now I'm going to bring in some philosophy just to kind of illuminate that kind of thing. So in the podcast talks a lot about the psychological effects, the reasons why these sorts of things happen. But philosophers have something to say about this too. We talk about it, and you might have heard this term before, epistemic closure. Epistemic means knowledge, concerning knowledge. And closure just means we're talking about bubbles. You might have heard of information bubbles or people being isolated, the algorithms, YouTube algorithms or Facebook algorithms, right, serving up what you expect and what's comfortable for you, and not giving you stuff that challenges your viewpoints, because they want engagement clicks and stuff like that, so they serve up stuff that you like, that you will click on. That contributes to epistemic closure. When you hear your own side more and opposing views less, then you sort, that's sorting, and that leads to hearing your own side's extreme views, that the extremists in your own side, the unusual fringe parts of your own side, more than you would because you're not hearing the other sides at all, gives more room, more platform for the extreme fringe parts of your view. So you see those as more normal. When you see those as more normal, then not only you're going to hear your side more and their side less, but you're going to hear more of the fringe more, and maybe less of the center of your side less. And that can kind of have a scary feedback loop between both of the sorting and polarization processes with respect to things like information sources that you trust or regularly visit for your news, or for your commentary, or for your opinion, or for your things like that. The language and the vocabulary that those news sources or information sources typically use, which can serve to cut you off from even understanding the other side, because they're using strange vocabulary that you don't understand. Or maybe they're using the same words as you, but they understand what those words mean significantly differently than you're used to. So they say sentences that are grammatical, but they sound like nonsense. They sound like crazy talk, because they're actually understanding the word has a different meaning to it. And if you actually understood the definition of that word as they are using it, then you could probably understand them better. But since you're so rarely exposed to them, and you already have a pre-existing definition for that word, that doesn't kind of cross your mind. And so it's much easier for you to dismiss them as not even understanding what they're talking about, because they're using basic words that everybody knows, wrongly. So they're just idiots, right? You also get a feedback loop here with respect to the kinds of typical examples that people will use, right? So one side will have a set of really kind of poignant, rhetorically effective examples, and the other side just isn't even informed that those examples exist, or if they do know about them, they can dismiss those as being cherry-picked, as being not representative, because we have our own store of examples, or our own set of evidence that is much more well-balanced, less ideologically infected with bias, or something like that. And you also get, if you're in one of these information bubbles, you get a lot of familiarity with the popular talking points, arguments, concepts that your side or your viewpoint commonly circulates within. And you don't get very much familiarity of other people's talking points, what their concerns are, how they think about things, except for mostly caricatures or dismissive takedowns of their particular viewpoints. And all of this stuff tends to drive those two peaks apart. So you spend more time with quote-unquote your people and much less time with quote-unquote them people, and you literally understand each other less. You're literally less capable of understanding the other side without some significant effort to break down the closure that has slowly developed around your particular ideology, perspective, viewpoint. And the other thing that also happens is that it's going to be much harder for you to practice that virtue of intellectual empathy, because those other groups are now so foreign in lots of their behaviors, in lots of their thinking patterns, in lots of their data and information and evidence. And also, not just because they're more foreign, but because everybody within your own group is so similar to you, you haven't had to exert much empathy to get along well with people in your own group, because they're so much like you. So that capacity to empathize with people doesn't really get exercised when you're hanging around your people all the time. So that can affect your ability to break free of epistemic closure as well. Now, this I'm going to go back to the psychology or maybe the sociology of this. There is some sociological results that kind of bear this out and help explain why the partisanship has grown. And that is basically that most people who are committed to, some political viewpoint represented by Democrats or Republicans, you're a small L liberal or lefty, or you're a small C conservative, whatever it is, it's not surprising that both Republicans and Democrats tend to hang out with people of their own kind. This is actually true through survey research, right? That you don't hang out with folks of the own party. Only 7% of Republicans have a lot of friends who are Democrats. About half have some friends who are Democrats. And even less with Republicans. Republicans may be even a little bit better sorted. Only 31% of Democrats, or 37% of Democrats have some friends, some or a lot, who are Republicans. And the numbers are not any better for so-called independents, that is, people who are not official members of the party. And you can see this kind of sorting, and the fact that the news is dominated by politicians, and politicians tend to be the more ideologically, quote-unquote, pure members of the party, right? On the fringiest elements, even though there are lots of moderates in both parties, they're the ones who get the airtime tend to be the ones on the fringe more, and they're more exciting, they're more newsworthy, right? They get you to stay tuned to that channel longer or click more YouTube videos when they're on, rather than some lame wonkish person, right? But one of the results of this is that, again, it feeds that cycle of sorting and polarization. Republicans, so how do Republicans view Republicans? This is how they kind of scale themselves. This is how they say, hey, most Republicans, sure, I view most Republicans like as being on the conservative end, but not dialed up to 11, whereas Democrats see Republicans as very ideologically extreme. Conversely, Republicans view Democrats as just a bunch of raving communists, whereas Democrats at least see their fellow Democrats as being much more moderate, right? So this self-image of Democrats, according to Democrats, and this self-image of Republicans, according to Republicans, those look fairly moderate, right? But the view of the opposing party and their ideological commitments is very much not representative of how the people in the party view themselves and the people that they know in the party. So there's some disconnect happening here, and that can be explained by the fact that Republicans and Democrats don't hang out much together, or maybe if they do hang out, they don't talk maybe much politics because we all get enraged and then unfriend each other or something like that. So, and here's just another chart to kind of pile on to that disconnect between actual polarization and perceived polarization. And I put this as, take this one with a grain of salt, because I think I got this from somebody's PhD research, so not quite peer-reviewed to that same extent as some of the other survey methodology that I have earlier on in this, but it's suggestive and plausible given all the other data that I showed here that the actual polarization between the two parties is much less than the perceived polarization, though the perceived polarization kind of does ups and downs. You might think back to when these peaks happen right here, what was happening right there to maybe make perceived polarization get even more disjointed from reality. But you can also see that that these guys are both heading up, which may or may not be a good thing. All right, so that's mostly psychology, mixed in with just a little bit of philosophy when I talked about epistemic closure, just to let you know that philosophers have their own kind of take on that stuff. More generally speaking, though, philosophers have their own kind of their own ideas about personal identity. They don't usually talk about political parties. That's too kind of real world application kind of stuff. Philosophers do talk about politics and political philosophy a lot. Freedom, all those other kinds of things that we talk about when we talk about politics. What I want to talk about here, though, is your personal identity. That is, what makes you you, which sounds really different than this topic of tribalism and bias and epistemic closure, but don't worry, in a couple slides, it's going to come right back around. there's two dominant approaches, just like when I was talking about ethics in the Clifford lecture, and I said there was kind of two big broad categories of thought about ethics, the consequentialists and the deontologists. There's two broad categories of thought when it comes to how people construct their personal identity, or what causes somebody to be the person they are. One broad camp is the individualists. Individualists think that, for the most part, your particular personal identity, that is, what makes you, you, is shaped primarily through your decisions. The people you choose to hang out with, the decisions that you make that shape you, kind of like Aristotle's virtue building, decision making, character, those kinds of things. Individualists think that the bulk of your personal identity is unintentionally or intentionally constructed by yourself, by the decisions that you make. In contrast, communitarians think that while we do make lots of decisions that do shape our personal identity, those decisions happen in the context of a society, and that even the decisions that get presented to us to choose between being this type of person or that type of person are presented in a large part by the society that we live in. And so the influence of our individual choices and who we are very limited, or even maybe non-existent, illusory. And so they think that your particular identity, what makes you you, is shaped primarily or perhaps entirely through the culture and that cultural environment that you find yourselves in, right? And so your particular decision to have such and such interests, your particular your particular set of values and principles chosen for you, even if you think that you thought them through and actively and intentionally chose them for yourself, a communitarian is going to say probably lots of that was an illusion. You went through these motions, but the very context that you were asking those questions in, and the people that were surrounded you and were influences on you, really guided you entirely, or the bulk of the influence was from the outside in shaping who you ended up. So I can go back to that analogy of a sports team, right? The individualist is going to say, yeah, sure, parents or close friends are going to maybe dictate early on what team you might choose to be a fan of, but that's never outside of your control, and at any moment, like you totally have the capacity as an individual to decide not to be influenced by the preferences, the sports preferences of your parents or your friends, and pick whatever team you like, right? And the choice not to change is a reflection on you, not particularly your environment. Communitarians, on the other hand, are going to say, no, it's not that at all. You're powerfully shaped both by parents and or friends about the kind of sports team that you choose, and the very fact that lots of people don't even question that as they grow older and technically maybe have the capacity to revisit their fandom and reevaluate it, the fact that they don't speaks to the power of those communitarian influences that discourage people from even questioning whether or not that they can change their allegiance, right? And in America, there's a strong tradition and philosophy of individualism. It's not so strong in other cultures, right? For instance, if we're talking about Chinese culture, the strain of Confucianism that is strong within China is deeply communitarian, right? Respect for elders, subsuming one's own interests in the favor of one's family, things like that. That's a very kind of deep commitment and deep difference between that culture and the typical American culture, which has a mythos of rugged individualism. And without checking right now, I want you to tell me what your earlobe shape is. This will become relevant shortly. Do you even know your earlobe shape? For some of you, this is an easy question to answer. For some of you, it's actually going to be pretty hard, and you might have no idea what your earlobe shape is. Okay, you can check now. Why am I asking this weird question? Well, because this is kind of a test. This is an argument that the communitarians might give you to say, well, you think you might be an individualist, and you think that you might have the control over what what makes your identity and what choices there are out there, and you're the choosing agent when it comes to how you are going to be. The communitarian's going to be able to use this example and say, you don't have nearly as much control over your self-identity as you think you do. And they're going to use this as an example, that I'm betting that there's a large percentage of you who had no idea what your earlobe shape was. But I'm even betting, though, that the people who do know their earlobe shape don't have earlobe shape in their kind of bullet list of things that make you, you, right? If I had to ask you, hey, describe yourself, your character, not so that I could recognize you in a crowd from your face, but so that I could, if I could directly see into your character, into your likes, your dislikes, that kind of, how could I recognize you from other people? What makes you distinct, a unique person, as opposed to the other people that live around you or just strangers, things like that? Earlobe shape would not be a thing, right? But you have other dangly bits that are very, very important to how you view yourself and to a large portion of your personal identity. You know which dangly bits I'm talking about, right? We have hugely important and very entrenched social institutions, cultural artifacts, and processes and practices that are very much involved in perpetuating, building up, validating fundamental differences between genders, between biological sexes, such that we're having tremendous fights and discussions in society today that are essentially arguing that we maybe shouldn't make such a big deal out of people's biological sex. Maybe we should treat it more like earlobe shape. We don't sort people. We don't tell people with detached earlobes. It's a social expectation that you guys use a different bathroom than people with attached earlobes, right? We don't have different clothing expectations or behavior expectations or career expectations of people with detached versus attached earlobes. Why not? We could. Like, it's theoretically possible that we could have grown up in a society where this was of enormous importance for some reason, right? The communitarian's going to say, the reason why these dangly bits don't matter, but the other ones do, is not under your control, right? That's a society thing. And the fact that it matters so much to you, which kind of group you belong in, or your decision to not to belong to one of those two groups, to transcend them, to deny them, takes up a lot of energy, right? All of that stuff, even if there are some, and you know, in society today, we're trying to open up maybe some more individual choice in there where people can kind of reject gender roles, can be gender fluid, those sorts of things. All of that still, says the communitarian, you're not saving individualism here. All you're doing is saying, you know, we've got a little bit of individual choice here, but that individual choice, that small amount, is still framed in the context of a society that has already kind of sorted people and had that expectation that we have these two general boxes of genders. And so society has itself framed the question, and at best your individual choice is picking which one, or to make that awkward, still currently awkward choice to not pick a box, to deny box choosing, right? And that has a lot of social ramifications too. And so philosophers recognize, communitarians are going to argue that the big difference between gender roles, biological sex, and sorting, those are real, just like earlobe shapes are real. That's not a social construct, the earlobe shapes. They're not fictional, that you can't make up your own earlobe shape. You could get surgery if you were unhappy with them, and it would be much less controversial than a sex change operation. And the reason for that is society, the community, not any individual choices. So that's how so I know that we mostly lean towards an individualist viewpoint in America, so I wanted to bring up this communitarian argument just to give you something to contemplate, that we might not be as in control of our self-identity as our individualism, our individualist perspective might want us to think, say the communitarians. Now, the reason why this is relevant, I mean, I opened up lots of cans of worms just there talking about earlobes and genitals, right? But another way that this kind of ties back specifically to the general topic of critical thinking and tribalism and the difficulty with getting people to be open to a message, to a point of view that's not the tribally familiar one, getting people to maybe be ready to change their mind, switch tribes, maybe dissolve tribes altogether, something like that, is to ask you this question. So I'll invite you to pause the video here and what do you think? Does changing your beliefs change you? And I mean, not just, is it Tuesday today or what? Because you could get corrected on that. That's not a core thing about you, right? Learning that your earlobe shape, that you were mistaken about your earlobe shape. Oh man, I always thought I was detached earlobe, but now I look in a mirror and they're attached. That's not, those beliefs about you aren't really pivotal, right? But if you had other beliefs change, right? From pro-choice, you went to pro-life, right? From being, having libertarian commitments about minimal government, you get persuaded, who knows how, right? That big government programs are better than leaving it up to the free market, something like that. Does having those belief changes change you, who you are? Can you contemplate still being you while having different beliefs than the ones that are kind of closest, that you hold tightly? Would you still be you if you didn't believe in the God and follow the religion that you do follow or don't, right? If you're an atheist, would you still be you if you changed to become someone who was very devout in a particular religious tradition? Would you be you if instead of the religious tradition that you had grown up in and believe and are devout and practice daily, right, that you became a follower of a different religion entirely? Would you still be you? Would you recognize that person? Or would that person now in an important way be totally different than the person that you are right now? And hard to imagine inhabiting that other person's body, perspective, point of view, because they really changing that one thing would turn them into somebody completely different. That's one of the important things that philosophers are going to say, is that if those beliefs are tied into your self-identity, they're part of how you see yourself as a person who believes this, as a person who believes that, then one of the consequences of that view on personal identity is that when you are asking other people to change your minds, which is what you're doing when you're having a political argument with somebody, then you are literally asking them to change themselves into somebody different that maybe they don't recognize. And if you're asking somebody to change themselves into somebody else, what you're effectively doing is asking them to basically kill themselves and give their life to somebody that isn't them. That's a big ask, right? If you can't imagine you being you, but just having pro-life beliefs instead of pro-choice beliefs, you can't imagine you being you without the belief that racism is a huge and pressing issue in society today, then imagine the shoe being put on the other foot and trying to convince that person who disagrees with you on those points. What you're asking them to do by giving up their current beliefs and coming and joining your tribe is you're effectively asking them to deny a large and important part of themselves, so large and important that they might not even recognize the new them. So you're asking them to do something that is very personally threatening. You're threatening their personal survival if those beliefs that you're asking them to question and reject are ones that they take as constitutive of who they are. So that's important because it really puts the kind of the scale of the task in proper relief for us. It might have been kind of largely invisible and natural and easy for us to get maybe to this really ununified collection of people all in our little epistemic bubbles, in our own little partisan camps. Talking across those camps and maybe convincing people to join your tribe because you think your tribe's the right one, it's going to take a lot of work. And maybe you're not ready for that, right? But at the very least, you need to be aware of the what we're talking about here. It's not just that they believe a couple things that aren't true, right? It's way more baked in to their fundamental worldview than that kind of characterization would have. And it's constantly reinforced by their partisan epistemic bubbles, right? It takes a lot of time and effort to change minds. So especially if tackling those issues, because you want to argue to understand and convince somebody to join your point of view, takes a lot of investment and possibly a lot of energy and maybe a little bit of emotional trauma if doing so requires you to kind of revisit stuff that you take very personally, and of course you do because it's constitutive of your personal identity, right? Then maybe it's not healthy for you to constantly engage in those sorts of fights, and you'd be a healthier, better you if you didn't do that, and maybe if you approached, these kind of tribal discussions in an alternative way, right? One of those ways is to just be an active listener, right? You currently might have a very inaccurate view of what the other tribe believes because the majority of your information about what the other tribe believe has come from fellow tribe members who might have an interest in keeping you in the tribe, or they might just have they're still trapped in that, probably still trapped in that same partisan epistemic bubble that you are, so they're reflecting back all the stuff that they've heard and just passing it along to you. They're not really giving you maybe the objective information, and the best information is often from the people who are in that other bubble. Just so listen to them, but not passively listen to them, actively. Be interested, explore, test politely, right? Be skeptical and follow through and ask them, why do you think that again? Where did that particular belief or commitment to this being a real fact, where did that come from for you? Ask those sorts of things, right, in order to better understand that other group. That could be threatening to you too, because if they give you persuasive answers to that stuff, that might have you questioning, wait, I came into this trying to convince people from that tribe to join my tribe, but they got all sorts of good answers, and so you might start thinking maybe it's time for me to leave my tribe and join their tribe, and that can be personally threatening. But for the most part, I think the biggest thing you need to realize after hearing all this stuff in the podcast and seeing some of these charts that I shared with you today is that you need to really understand that philosophy of personal identity and how deeply some of these beliefs are knitted into our very self-image. And so it's not the case that you're just trying to change a couple facts, a couple beliefs people have, and debunk a couple facts and get people to kind of see reality differently. That really undersells what you're trying to do here. So you really have to respect the threat that you represent. You're not just some person sharing knowledge or trying to enlighten them. You are, in a very real sense, trying to destroy them and replace them with an alien, with somebody completely different. If you're successful at converting this person and making them abandon the tribe that they currently belong to and join yours, you're killing them. And they may not appreciate that consciously, but you better believe that their system 1 reptilian kind of primitive brain completely understands what's going on and what's being asked of them if they kind of contemplate switching sides. And it is going to resist in every way it knows how, maybe even violently, because you are threatening its very existence, and everybody's got a survival instinct, right? So be properly respectful of that, and respect it within yourself too, right? When you interact with somebody who is of a fundamentally different persuasion from you, those emotions that you can feel, right? Now you know where they're coming from a little bit better, right? It's not just that they're getting the facts wrong and that you're so passionate about the truth that you want to correct people, right? It's that you are worried if they're right, not only am I wrong, but the I that is wrong will fade away if I admit that they're correct, because I will change my beliefs to more fit the truth, and the truth is just not compatible with my current mental existence. That's super threatening. So there's no surprise that it's hard to convince somebody who has been kind of a card-carrying member of a different tribe for a while to just, at the drop of a hat, think that, oh, I'll just drop some truth on them and they'll be fine. It's not that easy. All right. What's next? Well, if you're taking these readings in order, which why wouldn't you, right? Reading number 6 is going to ask a related question to this, also going to be focused on psychology. It's going to ask, can you discriminate without even realizing you're discriminating? So check out the proofs all on that. Do that, then watch the lecture, and then the post-lecture quiz and or reflection for that, and carry on with your readings.